This thing is crap. I mean, it sounds nothing like the original. I don't know what they did, but they did it wrong.
Oh my god, these things are amazing. I remember these. This is like what really defined my sound in the 2000s. I mean, like, this is everything. This is the best pedal I've ever owned. Welcome back to the 11th Fret, everybody. My name is Chris. Thank you guys so much for coming on back. Today, we are talking about something that I think is kind of funny because realistically, as musicians, we tend to have a lot of knee-jerk reactions when something new comes out, a new product. We try to compare it against the old product, or, maybe it's the new flagship model that replaced the old model, or it's a reissue of something that's classic. But whatever the reason is, we tend to hate it right up front. It just happens. And so today I'm going to be diving into a list, not say top 10 list, but a list of 10 things that we as guitar players used to hate, but now somehow love and look back on fondly. Like I said, this is not a top 10 list, so there is no list that's ranked from most expensive to least expensive or least popular to most popular. This is just a list of things that we once hated and now love. And I am in no way implying that any of these products are bad or undesirable. I'm just saying that we once hated them and now we love them. And if you disagree, please comment down below. Let me know what your thoughts are on the subject. And if you do disagree and you say that all of these products have always been awesome, hats off to you for having an open mind as a guitar player. So join me in walking down memory lane, remembering when these products existed, and maybe even today, some of them still do. Now, don't forget, if you do like content like this, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and possibly even that bell notification to be notified when we upload new content so you don't miss anything new. First, we're starting off with number 10. The Sovtek Big Muff, or also known as the Sovtek Red Army Overdrive, which was released originally in 1990 and discontinued finally in 2009. After Mike Matthews folded Electro-Harmonix for the second time in 1986, he was on tour out in Russia at the time with his then band and discovered a whole opportunity out there waiting for him. What he did is he rolled up his sleeves and acquired old military manufacturing compounds and started making vacuum tubes as the brand Sovtek, which is shortened for Soviet technology. Due to the rising popularity of used Big Muff pedals, Mike decided to reissue them from his new factory out in Russia. So what Mike Matthews did is he turned to the original schematic from his designer Bob Myers and then recreated the Big Muff circuit in the Red Army Overdrive, which only lasted for about a year at the longest, if I'm not mistaken. If you know anything different, let me know in the comments down below. From then, he reissued the Big Muff Pi. Some people thought it was the Big Muff 2. The initial reaction was that it was junk, it was garbage, it was made out of recycled Russian military parts, and a lot of that stuff was not very true. Now sure, the sonic qualities of the Big Muff Pi were different from its predecessors, but were they worse? Not really. A lot of people originally hated them because they were not authentic or faithful in sound to the original Big Muff design. Now, if anybody's followed the Big Muff history and maybe even collects Big Muffs, you'll know that every single version tends to sound different from one another. So it makes sense that the St. Petersburg manufactured Big Muff would sound different. Well, over the years, they would change the housing of the design. The color would stay green for quite a while, and then eventually would turn to black on the version 8 models, and eventually meeting its demise in 2009. Today, the Russian Big Muffs are looked upon fondly just as their predecessors prior to its release were. Once we all thought we hated these pedals, and some of you guys might still hate these pedals, that's fair, but as they stand today, they have become a classic in their own right, shaping the sound for a lot of bands that followed. Now, a lot of these pedals, though they're discontinued, can be had for a premium price anywhere between $150 to $1,000 on the used market. Or you could pick up a reissue from your nearest Electro-Harmonix dealer. Which goes to show you that a lot of these Russian Big Muff pedals have found their own place in history as a beloved, cherished, and prestigious item. Number 9, Danelectro / Silvertone from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There's no questioning that today the Danelectro line is a beloved line in the guitar industry, bringing back some classic designs from both their own catalog as well as designs inspired by the prior catalogs of other brands. But back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was not always that way. founder Nathan Daniel founded the Dan Electro Company looking to build guitars for catalog. He was able to secure exclusive distribution through Sears Roebuck catalogs, bringing forth a wealth of guitars to the market, and they were popular for the beginner. The guitar builds were unconventional in their design, and these guitars were met with positivity for the first-time buyer and then negativity as these players grew and developed away from these guitars. With that, a lot of these guitars received a ton of hate, but that hate was unjust, and we just didn't know it yet. That's the way guitar players always seem to be. We hate first, and then we come to accept later. The Dan Electro line was no exception. What ended up happening with the Dan Electro line is Nathan Daniel was using what most people felt were substandard materials to create the guitars, but he was also the first to create a micro tilt adjustment on the neck, which Fender went on to use themselves. He also created the famous lipstick pickup. Now, the lipstick pickup is more than just a name. Rumor has it that Nathan Daniel was looking to cut costs on pickup manufacturing and found a surplus of lipstick tubes from an actual makeup manufacturer and bought them. How he made the guitar pickups is he just took a single bar magnet and wrapped copper wire around it, stuffed it in the tube, and that became the pickup. The end result was a pickup that had no individual pull pieces, and because there was no pull pieces, this introduced a phenomenon known as note smear, where the notes were inarticulate every time you played through your guitar. And of course, with guitar players, we saw that and we realized that these guitars did not sound professional grade. We associated that sound with a beginner sound. But as time moved on and Dan Electro eventually folded, Jerry Jones out of Nashville would create his own versions of the classic Dan Electro line under his Jerry Jones brand name. These guitars were fetching anywhere between $1,500 to $2,000 at the time. They were a top dollar premium grade instrument. However, in the 1990s, you started seeing a lot of these bigger bands out there playing Dan Electros on music videos, and that helped catapult the Dan Electro brand back onto the market under the Yvette's Corporation in 1998 with the reintroduction of the U2 guitar, which was met with great fanfare up front, but eventually dwindled down due to poor sales, and they discontinued it from the market in 2001. Now, later on, like I said, the brand is a household name, and they're still cranking out guitars today, from these old classics all the way to vintage-inspired yet modern designs that are their own. Number 8, Peavey. Oh yeah, pretty much everything Peavey. Just about everything Peavey, with no good reason. Now, there's no disputing that a lot of you guys out there may have had your first instrument be somehow intertwined with a Peavey product, whether it was an amplifier or a guitar or both, a pedal, a microphone, a PA system. Peavey did it all. Now, they established their brand in the 60s with Hartley Peavey having created the logo in high school, that little lightning bolt logo that they're so famous for. Yeah, that was a high school design from Hartley Peavey from back then. Peavey has established itself as a brand that tackled the affordable, accessible market. The products were made in the USA, regarded today as very, very excellent, but as of every single release that they pretty much ever put out, with the exception of a small handful of things, they were always met with negative comments. Now, this is also predating the internet. Peavey was always viewed by many people as the make-do amp or the make-do product until you get the better product. Today, we look back on a lot of these products and we view them fondly. With the exception of the 5150, the 5150 amp changed a lot of things for a lot of people, and that amp today is probably one of the most coveted amplifiers that's ever come out of that factory. Today, it's been replaced with the 6505 and the 6505 Plus, but the 5150/6505 is a beloved amplifier by a lot of people who play heavy metal music. However, Peavey has always struggled to get in the forefront of a lot of people's attention in a positive way. For example, in 1978, the Peavey T60 came out, which was made from a solid oak body, but it was one of the first, if not the first, guitar that ever used CNC technology. The T60 also featured a lot of innovations that weren't commonly found in other competitive guitars at the time. You had the ability to do a coil cut, meaning you could half your humbucker and get a single coil sound. You also had a switch for out-of-phase pickups, so you can get that nice little quacky out-of-phase sound. There was a lot of innovations that came with the T60, and the T60 today is fetching typically over $1,000, give or take, on the used market because of how innovative it was. The T60 only lasted on the market until 1988, where it just kind of fizzled out without a whimper. No one knows why Peavey got rid of it, but if I really had to guess, it was probably due to the glam metal / hair metal era of the day, where even that trend almost killed the Gibson Guitar Company in that era if it was not for Slash playing a Gibson replica guitar by luthier in Hollywood, Chris Derrick. Another PV product that was snubbed at the time was the Classic line, and they've been doing a Classic line since practically the beginning. But in the early 90s, they released a all-tweed Classic line, which came in a 4x10 or a 2x12 version. Both were outstanding amplifiers, but they had a very sort of British sound to them, as opposed to the Fender equivalent in appearance, which would be like the Bassman or the Blues DeVille. The PV Classic 50 had a very nice, rich, high-gain distortion channel. It also unfortunately had a very loud fan because of poor ventilation into the amplifier, but most look back at the PV Classic 50, myself included, who still owns one, favorably. I think those amplifiers are outstanding, they play great, and they've gone on to become known as sleeper amplifiers from those who know. I can go on talking about almost everything PV, but let's focus on the Bandit because let's be honest, a lot of you guys have had a Bandit at one point or another, and if you have not had a Bandit, you know someone who did. The PV Bandit emerged in 1980 originally as the Bandit 65, and it has gone on through multiple iterations to try and change up the circuitry, change that sound a little bit to improve the product. It was a solid state amplifier that many people felt was either very cold and lifeless, or it was just a can of bees with its really high gain distortion channel. As time went on with the Bandit, they introduced the trans tube line, which is to try and emulate the tube sort of breakup through solid state circuitry, as the Bandit has always been solid state. And these days, people look back at the Bandit fondly, remembering how clean these amps sounded with the headroom that they provided. It's not that cold, stale sound that a lot of people remember, and now players are trying to go back and recapture that old Bandit sound. However, that amplifier, while it is a popular nostalgic amplifier for a lot of players, is still not something you will often find where a professional guitar player is going to be seen with one on stage. Number 7, Sovtek amplifiers. Yes, I know I've already covered Mike Matthews on this list with the Electro-Harmonix / Sovtek Big Muff, but his infamy goes on even further with the introduction of the MiG 50. About a year after Sovtek started cranking out tubes, Mike decided to bring in an amplifier that was based on a 1959 Bassman circuit onto the market called the MiG 50. The MiG 50 was aptly named after the infamous Russian aircraft at the time, and it was given the 50 for the amount of wattage this amp was claimed to have. Now, between the years of 1990 and 1991, the MiG 50 was identified as being under-spec'd on the output transformer, only putting out 30 watts, so down the road, the amplifier was rebranded as a MiG 30 with a MiG 50 to replace the original amplifier with the proper spec 50 watts, starting in 1992. Now, the amplifier was different in appearance. A lot of people who were shopping for amplifiers were used to their bigger names out there. You had your Marshalls, you had your Fender, you had all these big name amplifiers. You even had Soldano amplification cranking out stuff at the time as well. Boutique amplifiers weren't a very common thing then. So the Sovtek was met with a lot of opposition, not only because it was a Russian product, but because it looked cheap in nature. But it had its own unique sound, and a lot of people who owned that product found a way to make it work for them and make it sound outstanding. It could also be argued that the Sovtek, while it was modeled after the 5F6A Bassman circuit, that same circuit did go on to inspire the Marshall JTM45 as well as the Marshall Plexi, which have their own unique sounds as well. The Sovtek also established a reputation for having beautiful lows, a nice mid-range, and just a nice clean amplifier all around, and has since been revitalized as of a couple years ago by the Electro-Harmonix name today under the MiG 50 branding, but now this time instead of being made in St. Petersburg, Russia, they are made in New York City. But initially, when those amplifiers did come out, a lot of people did have their reservations, thinking that it was just a cheap Marshall clone made of brittle plastic and just junk, all that fun stuff, because they were affordable and they did have plastic aesthetics on them, plastic switches, all that fun stuff. So a lot of players naturally threw up their guards, and again, coming out of the whole Cold War era that happened a decade prior, it was met with a lot of resistance from a lot of players, except for those players who brought on those amplifiers because that's what they could afford, or they took a shot and were curious and then decided all on their own that these amplifiers were not bad at all, and they had a place in the spectrum of amplifiers available at that time. And even today, where the Electro-Harmonix name has reissued the MiG 50 line to players everywhere because, again, that amplifier has its own own sound that is deserving of being in place with everything else on the market today. You'll even see a lot of these amplifiers behind Josh Scott on his channel, JHS Pedals, for his JHS Pedal Show that he does constantly. Number 6, the TAC/Tascam Portastudio. The Tascam/TAC Portastudio first emerged on the market in 1979 as the first cassette multi-track recorder. Now, most people who understand cassettes know that there is a lot of limitations that come with cassettes. You don't have unlimited bouncing, and if you do, you're going to degrade the signal, and it's also very band limited, meaning that you're going to be scraping off certain frequencies from these recordings. And for the most part, people who owned these multi-track recorders were expecting some sort of magic, and they were anything but magic. You needed to have some sort of basic understanding of audio physics to be able to make these things sound relatively decent. Now, those amateur musicians out there who were tracking to a Portastudio may have had some captured magic, lightning in a bottle, if you will, and some just could not seem to get it right. So a lot of those players who were not doing well with the Portastudio, either their mix was too harsh or it was too quiet. Any of those things, looked at that entire product line as junk. It's, people who blame the controller for how bad they play a video game. Same sort of concept. Now, on top of that too, people were expecting some sort of studio grade magic that was happening into these Portastudios, but it was anything but. Now, as time progressed, the Portastudio would still find its audience out there until its final discontinuation, which was believed to be somewhere in the late 2000s. Now, the Portastudio cassette version did go out with pretty much not even a fizzle. Most people didn't celebrate its exit, and the Portastudio line still pressed forward onto the digital market, which did see the first digital product of the Portastudio line emerge in the 90s. However, in the late 2000s, the digital versions would take over the cassette versions because most people were looking for digital audio workstations, or DAWs for short, such as things like GarageBand, and there's also Audacity, and these days you also have Reaper and Pro Tools and Logic Pro and Cubase. You name it, there's tons of stuff out there. Unfortunately, the rising popularity of computer-based DAWs kind of ruined the whole idea of the cassette multi-track recorder, in addition to the fact that cassettes were becoming less and less popular as they've been replaced by CDs and digital formats that have come ever since. So cassettes were becoming more expensive to produce as they were considered obsolete technology. But today, a lot of people look to capture that lo-fi sound of the Tascam Portastudio. A lot of musicians are looking for these old Portastudios, and I've seen them go for as much as $1,500 on the used market, and as little as, if you're lucky, about $300 to maybe $400 on the used market. Now, there might be some statistical outliers out there, something way more expensive and some things that are way less cheap, but for the most part, I see them go for anywhere between $400 to $1,500 on the used market for people looking to capture that old lo-fi sound. Number 5, the Boss DS1 Distortion. Oh yeah, the Boss DS1 Distortion. I know, it's one of the most popular selling pedals in history, so how could it be on this list? Well, there was a time in the late 90s, early 2000s where the Boss DS1 was being viewed and treated in many respects as an entry-level pedal, an entry-level to the Boss catalog. Now, at the time, and even to this day, Boss has a wealth of pedal offerings out there, including dozens of distortions available. And a lot of these distortions were based around the DS1 circuit. But the DS1 did come out in 1978 and was met with much fanfare. And there were some other pedals out there as well, but the Boss DS1 kind of changed the way that pedals were viewed. Now, the original DS1s were made in Japan, and those pedals have gone on to have their own lore to them, and people are paying big money for the Japanese-produced DS1s. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, again, you had things like the Metal Zone, which is their most popular selling pedal to date. You also have like just this wealth of other pedals, and at Guitar Center or any big box music shop at the time, they were selling these pedals anywhere between $29.99 to $39.99 on sale all day long. I know because I used to work at Guitar Center and build those massive pyramid displays of Boss DS1s. It was always beginners who would come in to buy them, but for the most part, most people did not want to play through them. It was a pedal you wanted to graduate away from and move on to bigger, better things. And then it started becoming known as the Kurt Cobain pedal because he was known to have used it. Then it started coming out that Joe Satriani always uses them and keeps them on hand, that Steve Vai uses them, and that these are excellent mod platforms. And all of a sudden, it started showing up as a popular pedal again, something to work with, something that most people have brought forth and loved on their own rig, creating their own iconic sounds. So yeah, I know it's tough to even bring up a Boss DS1 on this list, but there was that period of time where this pedal was viewed as a basic pedal that you wanted to move away from down the road because it wasn't going to give you the sounds that you wanted. A lot of pedal builders such as Josh Scott or even Brian Wampler have credited this pedal as inspiring them to build more pedals, to mod, learn pedal circuitry, and then branch off from there and create their entire empire basically around the DS1. It's an amazing pedal, and I have 3 of them, and I love the pedal dearly, but there was a period in time where it was unmistakably looked down upon as it was on the market. It should also be said that in 2016, Boss did change the circuitry a little bit on the Boss DS1. They went down to a much smaller PCB board. So the 2016s or somewhere in 2016, they made this change. So if you see a 2016 pedal, and you open it up and you see a bigger circuit board, those are a little more desirable because they can be modded. The new incarnations of the pedals, I'm sure they can be modded, but no one's really ever published a schematic of them yet, or any optional tweaks you might be able to make to these newer versions of the pedal. But if you have a 2016 or earlier Boss DS1, those are getting good money on the used market because, again, they are excellent modding platforms. Number 4, Teisco. In the 1960s, it wasn't uncommon for people to view Japanese manufactured products as garbage.
No wonder this circuit failed. It says made in Japan.
What do you mean, Doc? All the best stuff is made in Japan.
Unbelievable.
Because back in that era, Japanese manufacturing wasn't as polished and refined as it is today. But it didn't stop brands like Teisco from manufacturing various versions of guitars based around what they perceived and push them out into the catalog market within the United States. Now, much like Dan Electro, a lot of people viewed Teisco as a beginner's guitar and something they wanted to move away from as they got better. This was the beginner guitar. This was the Squier Affinity Series Strat for the time. But those guitars were met with a lot of scrutiny because as you wanted to turn your guitar amplifier up, you were met with a painful and very loud squeal that would come from the pickups. But these kinds of pickups did inspire Billy Corgan and James Iha of Smashing Pumpkins as they were muting the strings to cause a squeal in the song Mayonnaise. A lot of these designs that Teisco created were a bit of a departure from the conventional designs that were seen on brands like Gibson and Fender and so on and so forth. So you always knew you had a Teisco guitar or a Japanese import guitar that was made by Teisco and branded something else because of the unusual shape and the thinness of the guitar. Probably one of the most famous or infamous versions is what's known as the Tulip. The Tulip, as it stands upright, resembles that of a tulip. And those guitars came in many incarnations, including some that had just one single pickup near the neck, some that had 2 pickups, some that even had 3. Now these guitars, because like I said, they squealed and they were really hard to tame, they were met with a lot of hostility and hatred, something you just wanted to get rid of and possibly even smash. Those guitars were often even found on clearance sections or bargain bins at used guitar stores all over the country for less than $100, if not less than $50. I found many back in the 2000s and in the 90s at garage sales for like $5 or $10 because they were very undesirable by the common player. But those guitars have their own unique sound. Those guitars have found a place with a lot of professional musicians out there, and as such, these days have grown in popularity enormously. So if you have any of these old Teisco Del Reys, they are worth some money. A lot of people might be getting like $300, $400, $500 for these old guitars, and realistically, I still wouldn't pay that, but you know what? There are people there who will, and so if I find one, I'm selling it for $400. But I still think the Tulip is very ugly. Number 3, back on the list for a second time is Dan Electro, but not the same Dan Electro. This is Dan Electro from the Evitz Corporation. This is the Dan Electro mini pedals released in 2000. There's no disputing that the resurgence of Dan Electro in the late 90s left a big splash on the market. Dan Electro was hungry to capitalize on this new modern retro sort of idea, and they had already released a set of pedals prior to these called the original series, which were big metal house tanks. And those pedals included, but were not limited to, the Fabtone, the Daddio, and the Cool Cat pedals. I mean, those things were legitimate tanks. I owned the entire set, and I loved them. I thought they sounded great, and those things were super, super heavy. Now, in 2000, Dan Electro changed things up a little bit, and they released what's called the mini pedals, or what some of you guys might refer to today as the Food Series or the Diner Series pedals. And the reason why they are known as the Food or Diner Series is because they all had names that would be found on a Greasy Spoon Diner's menu. You had pedals like the French Toast, the Hash Browns, the Black Licorice, the Pastrami, the Pepperoni, a lot of things like that. But they were really, really, really small in form factor, made of plastic, and felt really, really, really cheap. Even the potentiometers on there to adjust your settings felt cheap. A lot of these pedals were selling for $20, $25, $30 when they were on the market at the time, but a lot of players looked at them as cheap gimmicks. Something that would break, something that you wouldn't take on the road with you. They felt like something you would just go home with, plug it in, jam out on for a minute, then put it away, never to be seen again, or have it break indefinitely, and that was that. But as time progressed, these pedals have grown in popularity just as a lot of these other items have on the list. As the pedal community has grown, we have so many pedal manufacturers out there, from boutique names to big brands and everything in between. The Dan Electro pedal has served as an inspiration for a lot of these pedal builders as having their own unique sounds or being a great way to mimic bigger circuitry in a small box form factor. These days, these pedals can be found anywhere between $50, $60, $70 used on the market, give or take, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, but they are fetching big money and people are paying it. Number 2, Marshall Valve State Series amplifiers. There's no bigger name in rock and roll than Marshall. Whenever you think of Marshall, you might think of a certain top hat wearing, cigarette smoking, curly-haired player standing in front of one. There is a lot of players out there who have made their name standing in front of a Marshall stack of amplifiers. So in 1991, when Marshall revealed the Marshall Valve State for the first time to the market, it was an affordable solution to allow new players to have access to Marshall tones on the cheap. Something that we're pretty used to today, but back then there was no amp modeling, there was nothing like that, so brands tried their hardest to make things accessible. You also had brands out there like PV and Crate and so on and so forth tapping into that beginner market, and Marshall was trying to get a little slice of that as well because there's only so many people you could sell a big Marshall amplifier to. Now, what the Valve State line was a solid state amplifier that had a single preamp tube in there to warm up the signal. However, a lot of those people who played the Marshall Valve State series tried to find reasons to hate it. And the biggest reason they said they wanted to hate it was because it was solid state. It just sounded cold and dead. A lot of guitar players also formed that opinion without even playing one. They just read about them in a magazine, and that magazine had described what these amps were, and people immediately rushed to judgment, thinking that they would be cold and lifeless and lack that traditional Marshall sound. Well, Marshall would go on to revitalize that line in 1996 with the MK2, which added reverb, and then in 2001 they brought on the Valve State 2000 series / AVT. Now, to Marshall's credit, they did retire that line in 2011, and they launched a final product called the AVT Tribute to encompass the entire line, just to pay homage to how amazing that amplifier was, and they replaced it since with the MG series, which is completely and 100% solid state. These days, the Marshall Valve State series has been credited as a touring workhorse and an amazing tonal monster that was not given its due credit. Professional bands all over the country do take this amplifier on the road and jam out with it. It is known as one of the Marshall greats out there. It may not be held in the same high regards as the flagship amplifiers like the JCM 800 or the JTM 45 or the Plexi or the Blues Breaker or the DSL line, but it has found its own place and is becoming one of those legendary amplifiers that is sought after today due to its beefy and very, very accessible Marshall sound. And it is one of those amplifiers that has inspired a lot of people to try and get good money for them on the used market. And if you do see one used, definitely snatch it up because it is something you want to keep around the house for cheap. That sounds amazing. And number 1, last but not least, is the Crate Blue Voodoo amplifier. Now, I know this is going to be met with a lot of polarizing opinions. A lot of players have walked away from the Crate brand with a lot of hatred because that amplifier company has cranked out some turds in the past. And as they've created a bunch of turds, the Blue Voodoo amplifier has also been dubbed by many as the Blue Doo-Doo. But that out of the way, the amplifier did come out in 1995 and also had the option of either a 60-watt version or a 120-watt version. Plus, it had a birch cabinet cabinet loaded with Celestion Vintage 30s as an option as well. But that didn't stop professional players like Marty Friedman of Megadeth during that time from taking the amp out on the road and making it their sound. The amplifier is widely known for its high gain distortion tones on the second channel, but it also has just this nice clean sound, and a lot of audiences today who are still looking for a big amplifier to move into have found that the Crate Blue Voodoo is a very, very easily accessible amplifier to get your hands on. Now, the Blue Voodoo has gone through many different aesthetic changes over the years, as well as some changes to the cabinet design. The cabinets did lose their Vintage 30, and they started putting in their own speakers down the road that were Vintage 30 inspired, but not Vintage 30s, and they changed the design a few times, if I'm not mistaken, from the swoopy brush looking logos to something a little cleaner and hot looking, something that could blend in the background. But it was not the Blue Voodoo that was discontinued, it was the entire Crate brand that had come to a close. After their then parent company, Loud Technologies, had sold off the Crate name and disappeared without any sort of whimper in the late 2000s. The last instance of the website I could find captured on archive.org was in 2007, but there's a lot of rumors that state that the Crate products were still being cranked out until the early 2000s, but I don't have any way of knowing or verifying that because information is very, very, very scattered, although that brand does deserve a lot of praise. Not only because the brand itself has helped catapult a lot of people into playing guitar with their first amplifier, but also because they did crank out some amazing stuff that never got the time of day because of that unfortunate viewpoint that a lot of people had towards Crate for cranking out those beginner, very, very, very budget-oriented amplifiers. Like there's the Palomino line and the Blue Voodoo, and realistically, those were decent amplifiers. They might not be your amplifiers. They might not be an amplifier that you particularly like, but those are considered great amplifiers, popular by many guitarists today who are now tapping into what those amplifiers were and how they can integrate into their current sound, especially now that they are discontinued. No one can get them anymore, so once those tones are gone, they're gone. You might still hold some sour opinions about the Crate Blue Voodoo line, but realistically, I mean, let's be honest, you probably didn't have your pedal array that you do today. You probably don't have all those boutique pickups you've been trying out now. You probably don't have that entire rig that you rely on today to plug into that amplifier. But realistically, those amps are awesome. They do sound great. Give them another chance if you ever see one or have the opportunity to play it, because they are great. They're handmade in the USA, or at least the earlier ones are, and I think they are pretty awesome amplifiers. That's it. That's the list for now. Do you agree with any of those things I've listed? I mean, comment down below. How dare you? How dare you mock my blah blah blah? I didn't mean to mock it. I'm just calling it out for what it was based on my perception. This is from my time working in many music shops, hearing the talk, the gossip from all the players who would come into the shop, as well as looking through online forums and things like that, just hearing the hate, reading the hate, seeing the hate, and then all of a sudden, suddenly seeing nothing but love. So again, let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on it. If you like content like this, make sure you like, comment, and even subscribe to the channel. Hit that little bell notification to be notified when I upload new content so you don't miss anything. And also, maybe even share this video with your friends. You never know. I want to get some angry people in the comments. Thank you guys so very much for joining me on this little excursion. Again, my name is Chris. I look forward to seeing you guys on the next one.